right, hello everyone, and welcome to our Internal Audit Insights. Today, we're going to be talking about third-party risk management from a cybersecurity perspective. I'm Mignon Davis, and I run Internal Audit here at Richie May, and I'm joined today by Parker Brissett, vCISO and Senior Cyber Consultant here at Richie May. All right, let's dig in. So in part one of this series, we covered vendor management from an operational perspective and discussed its importance for operational efficiency, reducing risks, optimizing costs through effective oversight and collaboration. Now we're going to follow up with this part two to dive deeper into third-party risk management from a cybersecurity perspective. So from this perspective, Parker, what is third-party risk management? Why is it important? And how are cyber risks different from operational risks?
Yeah, there's a lot of intersects in how operational risk and cybersecurity risk can come about. And when we're looking at third-party risk from a cybersecurity perspective, we're really trying to identify those vendors that have access to a lot of confidential information, proprietary information, and based on their security controls could really affect how your data and your IP or any other items that you want protected can be impacted. So we find it really important to make sure that you're asking cybersecurity related questions of your vendors. You are assessing those critical vendors and as many vendors as you can to be able to identify how risky they are to your business and how well they are structured from a security perspective.
Okay, yeah, I love that. That gives us a lot of things to think about. And you're right, we have to ask the right questions, right? Otherwise, we're not going to find out all the juicy details that we need. So, from an operational standpoint, in the last session, we discussed the importance of obtaining insight from key stakeholders, such as the business units who use the vendor, because I think it is important to understand how we're going to use that vendor. What is that vendor going to do for us? What access to what systems are they going to have? What data are they going to have access to? So we have to understand from the key stakeholders and business units, what is that vendor going to be doing for us? What is the work that we are contracting with them to do? We need to find out data privacy information, access to borrower information or consumer data that's non-public private information. So what additional things do you consider from a cybersecurity perspective when you assess these risks of the third-party vendors?
Yeah, everything you just listed is super important to start out what we are assessing and what we're looking for, right? You want to understand the engagement. So if you're applying the same level of assessment to every vendor, you may not be considering every angle, and those operational components definitely feed into this process of now digging deeper into the security controls. So what we kind of add to all of that in the specifics is a few things around the engagement, right? So if there is direct access to your environment in any kind of way, whether that's network based, whether that's they have accounts in your environment, whether it's they have access to your databases or different things like that, it's important to consider all of those elements of an engagement. One of the items that I like to call back to from a long time ago, Home Depot had a security incident caused by a vendor that did their HVAC. And it was because their HVAC had access to the same network that all their data was on. So it is really important to understand that configuration so that you can assess the risk and potentially mitigate that risk before you even start that project. So those are the things we're trying to identify by having all of that information and then asking those questions about what is your security configuration? What does this look like? How do you control, monitor, manage any of these various components that could add risk to your environment from a third party perspective?
Wow, that's really interesting. I wouldn't think that an HVAC vendor would have access to the systems. So that is really interesting. But that's where questionnaires come into play. You know, a lot of clients have built out questionnaires, and I know we fill them out as a vendor too. And sometimes, you know, we say, oh, you know, all this stuff is not applicable. And it kind of sometimes feels like, why are we even filling this out? But it is really good because if you may be surprised by some of the answers that you get. Like in this case with the HVAC vendor, they fill out all these things on this questionnaire and answer all these questions, and you realize, oh, they're going to have access to our systems. Like that's how you find out, is by asking those questions. Even if you think it's not going to be applicable, it might be. It might surprise you. So it's good to have that questionnaire built out and ask those questions no matter what type of vendor it is when you onboard them. That way you can appropriately assess that risk and figure out, hey, this might be a higher tier vendor than we originally thought. And so those questionnaires are very important. Parker, what about certifications? Do we want to look at or ask for certifications that the vendors might have, SOC reports or other certifications?
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding your engagement helps lead to whether or not those certifications cover the area that you're engaging in business with that organization, because things like ISO 27001 and SOC 2 will lay out in those reports what was assessed, what part of the organization is covered in the scope of that. So by taking all of that operational information of how's this engagement going to look, you can understand specifics of, hey, their SOC 2 report covers the AWS environment that the vendor's utilizing, and we know we're not going to be using that technology. So now we need to ask some different pointed questions because that area wasn't assessed. Or it's very beneficial if it was like, yes, we are going to use that AWS engagement. So this report is really relevant, and it gives us some confidence in the controls that are in place because it's been certified by a third party. So that means your line of questioning and digging in can be a lot lighter. You still really want to make sure you're asking those important operational questions and then using those certifications to kind of just augment how many more questions you want to ask. That way, you're not bombarding your vendors with questionnaires when technically they've already answered those questions with a third party and it's been really, really validated, because vendors can get real cagey in how they respond to those questionnaires and how much information they give away. So those are really good reports to trust. And there's a lot of considerations in reading those reports and what they apply to and how well those controls were implemented.
Great. Yeah, that's great information about important things to look for in those reports. What happens if a vendor does not have a SOC report or does not have the ISO 27001 certification or anything equivalent to that? What kind of things would you consider or ask for in addition to the questionnaires? Anything?
Yeah, there's a common set of questions to ask to kind of get a broad picture of the security environment and the security controls that an organization has in place. It'll ask things from, what are your policies and procedures? Do you have these in place? How often are they reviewed? When was your last penetration test? What does your encryption process look like? So there's a common assessment and information questionnaire. It's called CAIQ, CAIQ, which is pretty comprehensive, and it's free, provided by the the Cloud Security Alliance. I believe the CSA it's a government agency, so it's a questionnaire out there that anybody can use, and it's very comprehensive in terms of what's covered. So that gives you broad coverage, but I also like to make sure that we're asking pointed questions. So you don't have to do the full cake. There is ways of just pulling out of that things that are most relevant to the engagement, right? If they don't have data in the engagement and they aren't accessing it or they aren't storing it on your behalf, it's not really relevant to ask them about their data encryption process, right? So it is important to consider that. I know it can get really, really challenging with the number of vendors that can come into play and having this gigantic landscape of potentially critical vendors that you're trying to assess as quickly as possible. But I find it's really important to slow down and make sure you're taking the time to ask the right questions so that you can get good responses. Because if you're just throwing gigantic questionnaires at your vendors, they're going to look for the simplest, easiest answers that really may not give you all the information you need.
Yeah, yeah, and that really goes back to understanding the work that that vendor is going to do for you too, right? Because that's going to narrow down a lot of the questions that you're going to ask, but also point you to more specific questions that you need to ask. So really understanding and working with the key stakeholders and business units, again, like we talked about previously, that's really, really important. What about, Parker, what about business continuity and disaster recovery? Anything specific that you look for when onboarding a new vendor or doing annual monitoring?
Yeah, with relation to both your own organizational business continuity as well as your vendor side of that, it's important to understand that part of the process of engaging with vendors is including them in your business continuity plans because oftentimes they are very critical to you remaining operational. One of the easiest items to consider here is your internet service provider. So if you have a main office and you have a single provider like a Comcast or a Spectrum or something like that, and you've got a single point of failure, you want to make sure that's considered in your business continuity plans. What do we do if our vendor becomes unavailable? And that also translates into how you consider the risk from your vendor. What is the likelihood of an outage? What's the guarantee that they're providing you from an SLA perspective, service level agreement of, hey, we promise we'll be up 99.999% of the time, and that can give you some more reassurance of their continuity processes. And so if you have other vendors outside those scopes that are providing critical services to you, it is important to look at that from a contract perspective of, is there a guarantee of uptime? And in your questions that you're asking, understanding what the continuity plan is for those organizations as well, because it can be really helpful. I used to work in a BPO, so call centers, massive call centers. And so we were a critical vendor for a lot of organizations. So if the call centers weren't able to take calls, then customer service wasn't being delivered. And so we did engagements with our customer to run through business continuity tests and things like that. So if you have a vendor like that that you're actively engaged with and can participate in cooperative tests and scenarios and run through, that can bolster not only your relationship with them, but your ability to maintain your business continuity. So very important piece that a lot of people kind of forget and the business continuity. They look at only the things that they control and can forget that a lot of their critical vendors impact their availability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we saw that recently with a third-party outage that really impacted a lot of different industries. So I think that's very, very critical to look at those continuity plans. And after you categorize and do all the risk ranking and everything of these vendors, that's part of that next step, right? Is to look at those. And then, like you mentioned, systems being offline. I know. ICE, for example, which a lot of people use Encompass as an LOS, they have internal SLAs like you mentioned, where that they pretty much guarantee, or that's their SLA, that if anything goes down, they have an SLA that they'll have their systems back up and running within a certain period of time. So that those are the kind of things that you'll want to look for, like you mentioned. So I love that. So what about ongoing monitoring of high-risk vendors? Once you onboard them, you've gathered all of this information, you've asked all the right questions, you've added them to your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You've really ranked everybody. You know who your critical vendors are. How do you monitor them on an ongoing basis? Because we kind of talked about that in the first session, from an operational standpoint. Doing scorecards, holding them to their SLAs. Things like that. Is there anything else from a cybersecurity perspective that you can recommend that clients do from an ongoing monitoring perspective?
Yeah, it's very similar, right? You definitely want to make sure that you've got centralized vendor management so that you have that comprehensive look of who are your vendors, who are your high-risk vendors, and so that can enable your security process to also reanalyze that at least annually, especially for your critical vendors. You're going to want to check in and go, hey, what changes have you made since we started this engagement? Give me your latest SOC 2 report, your latest ISO certification. I want to be able to identify if an auditor found something new in your environment or any of those items have come up. So at least annually, you want to go back and see where things have changed. You don't necessarily need to go into the full depth of assessment again, because typically your engagement with the vendor is going to stay somewhat consistent throughout your engagement, but there are going to be changes, right? The vendor may make different system updates or changes, and so it's important to go, hey, we weren't monitoring every single change throughout the year, but now that it's been a year, we want to understand all of those different changes and where we may need to ask some new questions about, hey, it looks like through this engagement, we did actually decide that you were going to process some data for us. And so that now transitions us into potential privacy concerns. And we need to understand some of those elements, can transition into now we need to ask you about your data encryption process. And that's super important to realize. So I think it's always important to make sure the security process is well aligned with that operational assessment process, and that you do have that recurring engagement of assessment. Especially from my experience on the cybersecurity side, there's always at least some change in how a vendor's delivering their service to you that you do want to ask some pointed questions about how they secured that new process.
Yeah, I love that. And even if you've ranked a vendor or a third party as maybe not a high risk, maybe they're the next tier, whatever tier rankings you're using, that maybe they're like a medium risk. Um, if the services change, like you mentioned, the engagement can change. Maybe they expand the services that they're offering to you. And now, like you mentioned, now they are going to have access to data where they didn't before. So that's really key to be able to identify those vendors that are not high risk, that you may not be evaluating annually, and have something that triggers you, whether it's the business lines letting you know, hey, we're expanding our services with this vendor that's already set up. We need to let you know that now, they're going to be doing other things for us, may potentially have access to other systems, things like that, so that you can reevaluate them. Something to trigger you, because if it's not a high risk vendor, you may not look at that vendor and recertify them for 2 years. And in the meantime, a year after you boarded them, they've now had access to systems or data that you didn't realize, and you didn't get to ask all those questions, right? So having some kind of triggering event or system of notifications to that vendor management team to let them know that, hey, we need to reevaluate this vendor sooner rather than later because we're changing our engagement, they're expanding services, we need to look at a few other things here. So I love that you mentioned that. So Parker, another thing that I wanted to ask you about was terminating vendors. So we did talk about that in the first session from an operational standpoint. You've got to let people know, hey, quit putting in orders with this vendor as of a certain date, right? Make sure any outstanding orders are completed, invoicing is done, all of that stuff, right? But from a cyber perspective, what do we need to worry about when we're removing a vendor, and thinking about data privacy or system access?
Yeah, one of the top 5 causes of an incident comes from third-party engagements, right? So it is one of those high-risk areas. So it is very important that if you're no longer engaged with a vendor, that you are properly removing access, that you are making the request for data removal and data deletion. We have various engagements with customers that even though annually we continue engagement with them, they want a 30-day lifespan on the data that we have for them. So we transfer whatever reports or information that we have over to them and automatically delete it within 30 days on our side of things. And so that's one of those important areas of you can have that level of expectation of your vendors of now we laid out, hey, what does this engagement look like? Where do you have access? We've looked at those security components, and now, okay, we're going to end this engagement with this vendor. You absolutely want to look at the data, whether it's stored by them or stored by you, and making sure that you get a copy of anything that they have related to your engagement, because you might not necessarily just want it deleted, right? Because whatever that vendor was doing for you may have been beneficial, and you may want to transition it into another format. So getting your data back and then requesting the data deletion. There are different ways to get certification that data has been deleted. Oftentimes it's a little bit more difficult with cloud environments. If we're dealing with physical hard drives and things, you can get a certified letter that it has been shredded and things like that. But typically you can request some form of evidence that they have deleted it, whether it's a simple screenshot of their AWS environment that shows that they walk through the steps to remove your data. Those are really important things to make sure if you're no longer continuing engagement with a vendor. Data is almost the most critical from a cybersecurity perspective. And then access, right? Definitely make sure it's part of your vendor lifecycle management that any access to any of your systems or environments is clearly revoked and done in accordance with the overall project but very, very timely.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely important. All right. And a lot of times people don't even think about terminating vendors. And, when I talk to clients and I ask them, what their process is for terminating vendors, they're like, well, we haven't really had to terminate a vendor. I'm like, okay, but that's good that all your vendors are working out and that's great. But you have to have a plan in place, right? You have to know what you're going to do if and when that happens. So it's really good to be talking about this and be able to think about what you want to do and have something in writing and that your people can follow. Your employees need to have this information so that they have step-by-step guide of all the different things that they need to consider. All right, so let's move on to the last topic, which everyone is talking about, which is AI. Is there anything that we need to be concerned about when with all this expansion of everyone using AI?
Yes, simple answer to that question. There's a lot of growing concern, and understandably so, with any new technology. We don't start with a security first focus on what that's doing, right? It's new technology. It's looking to improve processes, and so it's very, very useful. And whether you think you're utilizing it in your organization or not, I can guarantee it is being utilized in some fashion, even if it is with your vendors. And what we here at Richie May are focused on from the cyber side is conducting AI risk assessments with vendors. So this is an added augmentation of your general cybersecurity assessments, where we're looking at the engagement and how the vendor may be utilizing AI technology to deliver you services. So that does mean things like intellectual property or your data that is going into the vendor, and the vendor is using an AI technology to process any of that. We are assessing that AI specifically. How are we certain about the data sovereignty of this? How are we certain that when we request to delete our data, that your AI is going to remove any of those data sets? How can we count on what you're providing us that may contain AI augmentation or some production or output from that? How can we be sure there's human oversight in that process? And if they're a developer of AI technology, we're asking them very specific questions about their AI models and how they're securing those things. So very, very important to add in the AI assessment into your security assessment. So if you can identify any of your vendors that may be using AI technology in your engagement, it's really important to start getting that information now so that you can start setting some boundaries with your vendors and establishing how they use your data.
Right. So anything else that you want to add that Richie May might be able to help clients with?
Yeah, just like you've mentioned, you've filled out tons of these assessments as a vendor, and with our advisory services, I fill out a lot of these for my VSSO customers responding to these items. So we're pretty well versed in understanding this process that we've walked through and establishing a third-party risk management program and structure as well. So really love to do this, right? My biggest thing, especially as a VSISO, is making sure the business is operational, still running, and these vendors that are critical to the organization, we're really looking at the risk and what we can do to mitigate that. So I'm usually not a no man. I'm a what's the risk and how much can we tolerate here, and where can we make adjustments. So Richie May Cyber Team is always looking at third-party risk constantly across our client base. So if you've got questions or concerns about more specifics, I would love to have a conversation and either help you build that program out or support you in running that.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk too about NYDFS requirements, and I know that your team has helped a lot of clients in that regard as well. Anything you want to talk to about that?
Yeah, NYDFS is setting and establishing exactly everything that we've talked about today. These are the expectations of NYDFS as well as many other regulations. You have to know your vendor risk and you have to know their security profiles. So we've got a good perspective on how to approach those things. So definitely an important element from compliance and regulation.
Yep. All right. Well, we want to thank everyone for their time today. We hope that you found this information beneficial. If you have any questions or you'd like to discuss more about how Richie May can help, please contact us. Thank you, Parker, for being willing to come on here and give us all this great information. We really appreciate it. And next time, we're going to dive into another one of our internal audit hot topics. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.